tam راكجوني تاتيكوي حساسة بشكل دبوش نشان غير بشكل
Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. That was a Zagros rifle, basically made from a 12.7mm DShK barrel. These are guns that are being manufactured by the Kurdish YPG forces in, well, Syria and Iraq. And these are some guys who are out there actually fighting ISIS on a day-to-day basis. This is a group that, well, it's, as with all groups in this area, it's liked by some and disliked by some, and they have gotten a fair amount of material aid from the United States. But that aid didn't include anti-materiel rifles, and so they decided to build them on their own. So what's involved in doing this? Well, it's actually simpler than you might think, because what they're building here are single-shot rifles, and the barrels already exist. These guns, we'll talk about details in just a moment, but these guns are 12.7 and 14.5mm, and in a few cases 23mm, and all of these are barrels and cartridges from Soviet machine guns or light cannons. So in order to quote-unquote build the guns, what they're basically doing is taking an existing barrel and manufacturing a bolt and a tubular receiver for it. This is actually something that was done a fair amount here in the United States to build civilian single-shot 50 caliber rifles. There were people who wanted to do that from a kit, and so there were a number of sets of plans and commercial parts out there for taking a Browning M2 50 BMG barrel and building it into a single-shot rifle. And that's very much what they're doing here. So the pictures in the video that you're seeing here actually came to me from this gentleman right here. He served with the YPG from like summer of 2015 through late summer in 2016, and sent me these and some really interesting bits of detail on the guns themselves and the development that went into them and how they were used. So let's start with the fact that there are basically two different versions. The rifle in the back here is a Zagros 12.7 by 108mm. That's the Soviet DShK cartridge. And then the rifle in the foreground here is a Şer, which is built on a 14.5mm KPV barrel. Now, the version that you see here is actually what he's calling the Şer Portative, which is a lighter, a cut-down version, basically. In it, with its full barrel length, this is really a two-person job to transport, and so the YPG decided to experiment with a shorter version that would actually be single-man portable, and that's what they came up with right there. Now, according to my correspondent, these Şer Portatives were introduced in like July of 2016, and his unit was one of the very first groups to actually use them in action. He says they kept the 50 caliber rifles, the 12.7s, the Zagros rifles, for long-range shooting, interestingly, while using these for closer range. The reason being the concussion from this thing was apparently absolutely monstrous, which that doesn't surprise me at all. He says these things would destroy scopes within like 5 rounds. Now, that kind of makes me wonder how they were zeroing them, and I suspect they were just bore sighting these. And I also suspect they were probably using Chinese manufacturer scopes that aren't really all that good. Access to really high-end scopes like we might expect here in the US is, well, not trivial in a place like Iraq or Syria. However, the 50 caliber rifles, the Zagros, were much more practical to shoot. They had less recoil. Presumably you could do a much better job zeroing them with a scope because the scopes would survive much longer on the comparatively light 50 caliber cartridges. Now, interestingly, he mentioned that this particular gun that you're seeing here was not very reliable for them. And he says, as he recalls, it was like serial number 20. The Kurds, the YPG, actually has a weapons development center, and they take this rather seriously. And these aren't one-off cobbled together guns. These are actually built to plans and made in serial production. And he said later in this fight, they received a different Şer Portative, and it was far more reliable for them and didn't give them the problems of this early one. And that sounds totally accurate to me. That's exactly how arms production and development works. The early ones have some issues, and they figure those out and make subtle little changes to the design that fix the issues, and later production guns generally work better. Here's another interesting picture. This is a picture of the arms that were in use by my correspondent's sniper platoon when he arrived. This was a picture from September of 2015. And the most interesting thing here is that weirdly camouflaged gun with the box magazine. And apparently this is a 14.5 millimeter Şer with an experimental box magazine and collapsing or folding stock. And he said he never actually saw that one fired because apparently it had been sent to these guys for evaluation and turned out to be not very useful. Apparently had a lot of problems. So it was sidelined before he ever got there. But next to it is a 12.7 millimeter Zagros, and then wrapped up in that sheet on the top. I've turned this picture sideways to fit the video aspect ratio. That rifle wrapped up in a sheet is another 14.5 millimeter Şer. By the way, that one wrapped up in the sheet is a full-length Şer, not the cut-down portative version. So you can see how much longer it is than the Zagros. These guns were all made by the YPG, and apparently they had a pretty good reputation in defensive actions, having been used fairly extensively before the YPG started to get the benefit of a lot of US air support, which obviously is more effective and useful than the heavy caliber single-shot anti-materiel rifle. So this correspondent of mine was part of a 3-man squad, and here is a shot of all of their loadout. So what we have here is, in the very front, a 12.7 Zagros, and then 2 of the Şer Portatives 14.5 millimeter guns. Behind those are a pair of Sako TRG-22s in 7.62 NATO, and then at the very back, a trio of AKs. Everybody here in this unit had an AK as like a basic personal weapon. Apparently some of the guys did have access to M16s, typically with Chinese knockoff ACOGs for optics. You can see what looks like an EOTech and an aim point on 2 of those AKs. Whether those are authentic or Chinese copies, there's no way to tell from these pictures. Here we have a little brief bit of video of a Zagros in action in 2015. Note the belt of ammunition there. What they're shooting in these rifles isn't precision, purpose-made sniper's ammunition. It is machine gun and light cannon ammo that's being repurposed in these rifles. So this ammo is in stockpiles over in this part of the world as machine gun ammo. So you pull it out of the belts and use it in your single-shot rifles. So this may not be the most accurate ammunition in the world since it was actually made as machine gun ammo, but presumably it's accurate enough for the purposes that these guys are putting it to. I think this is not so much sniping the way Americans would think of, shooting some guy in the head from a gazillion yards away. This is more anti-material rifles being used against heavy walls, against vehicle-based IEDs. In particular, something like this would give you a much better shot at stopping a car bomb than something like a 7.62 caliber rifle. Changing gears a little bit, these 2 rifles are apparently my correspondent's personal armament through most of his time in Syria. He says that dazzle pattern with the tape on the AK is remarkably effective at night, and then the white tape on the Dragunov magazine indicates that it is a magazine of API. He said it was better than just standard ball, but it was still pretty iffy stuff on vehicular IEDs. He said by the time he was using this, a lot of the vehicles were armored to the point that a 7.62 caliber rifle like this one wasn't necessarily all that effective, but the API was better than nothing. Changing gears a little bit more, here's another, just a really interesting rifle. This picture was taken in July of 2016, and it is an experimental AK pattern rifle made by the YPG. They do experiment with arms, and they do their own development, and this is something that they put together to see how it would work. It is clearly a 7.62 by 39 caliber AK with a significantly extended barrel. It's interesting that upper handguard there ends in what appears to be an AK slant break, which seems to me like it has to be just an aesthetic addition. They've got a Soviet scope on it there, so obviously the receiver has a side rail mount. My correspondent says he's not sure if this is a production thing or just an experiment. I suspect it's an experiment, but hey, who knows? It's a really pretty cool looking rifle, actually. It'd be kind of fun to have a copy of that. And then we'll just finish this up with a couple of extraneous technical pictures. Here we have a couple of vehicles that have dual KPV mounts on the back of them. So this is the sort of gun that the barrels for those 14.5 millimeter Şer rifles come from. If they have a KPV, you can pull the barrel off and presto, turn it into an anti-material rifle. Apparently they did also occasionally do this with 23 millimeter guns, but those, I guess, were very infrequently used. It sounds like they were so heavy and importable that they were just a little impractical to actually use. Even the 14.5s were something that could really only be used on the defensive because they were difficult to move around, just not that mobile. The 12.7s apparently were, it sounds like, the best of the bunch, the most well-liked and the most universally practical and useful. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I really appreciate my anonymous correspondent providing me with these pictures and video. It's really cool to get a look at what these guys are actually doing in the field. We may have abandoned the idea of the anti-tank rifle a long time ago because tanks have too much armor, but in conflicts like we're seeing in the Middle East and North Africa, there aren't a whole lot of actual tanks driving around, and there are a lot of light armored vehicles, well, kind of like these technicals. So the rifle has kind of made a practical comeback in those conflict zones. If you're interested in seeing more information on this sort of armament, definitely check out ARES, Armament Research Services. They actually have a report upcoming. I don't know the exact publication date yet, but when it is available, I will link to it in the description text of this video. That is a report on craft-made and improvised weapons, and it's going to include a section on anti-material rifles like this.